For this test, we're going to be talking about domain and range of functions. So it's important to talk about what those are first. The domain is a spread of all the possible x values. So any x value that is there is the domain. On a graph, which is usually how you see domain and range questions asked, on a graph we measure domain from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So I usually say from the left to the right, which makes sense. That's the way you read it. You find the left-hand place, you find the right-hand place, those two values. The range then is going to be a spread of all of the possible y values. And on a graph, which again is usually how you're going to measure that, this one is a little bit tricky. We go from the bottom to the top. Everybody wants to say from the top to the bottom, but remember that the smaller numbers are on bottom and the bigger numbers are on top. So we're going from the bottom to the top. We're rising up. So before we go in and we actually calculate this, I just have a couple quick notes. If a graph continues on in any direction, so if the graph doesn't have a left-hand side or it doesn't have a top or something like that, that limit is either going to be negative infinity or it's going to be positive infinity. Now, just as a quick aside, negative infinity are going to be the really negative numbers. And the directions that are negative, so if a graph continues to the left, that's where all the negative x values are. Or if a graph continues all the way to the bottom, that's where all the negative y values are. For positive infinity, then, all of the positive x values are going to be on the right-hand side, or all the positive y values are going to be on the top. So if you see a graph and it does not stop on the left-hand side, we're going to go to negative infinity. If you see a graph and it does not stop at the top, we're going to go to positive infinity. So that's anywhere where it doesn't have a solid dot to say this is where it stops. If a border happens on an open dot or does not end, right, one of those, it doesn't see the end, we're going to use the less than sign. And that's the one that looks kind of like a capital L slanted. Now in my notes, I usually have to write in that this guy is less than, because I know that sometimes it's easy to get those confused with a greater than sign. In all other cases, so most of the time, so if you don't see an open dot or if you see where it ends, you're going to use this one, which is going to be the less than or equal to. All right, so as we go down the list, what we're going to do, we're going to determine whether or not the graph is a function, then we're going to state the domain and range. Now, I will tell you for this part that you do need colored pencils. This works best if you take good notes and if those notes are colorful, because it's going to help you out. I'm going to be changing the color on my screen, and I think that it would be a really good idea if you went to the back counter and grabbed yourself some colored pencils real fast. So firstly, determine if the graph is a function. We can do that real quick because that was in the last section. Remember that if you're looking at a graph, then in order to be a function, it has to pass the vertical line test. Or in other words, anywhere you hold a vertical line up, it is only allowed to hit at most one time. So go ahead and take a second and figure out if you can determine if these are functions or not, or which ones are, which ones aren't. All right, if you guessed that these were all functions, you are correct. Any case, no matter where you hold a vertical line, you're always going to only hit one time. So, under function, I just wrote a whole bunch of yeses. But let's get to the meat of it, which is domain and range. So, if you'll remember from up top here, domain is the x values we measure from the left to the right. So this is where colored pencils are going to come in, and I'm going to do the domain in red, and see how I circled domain in red so that it points out. I need to find the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and I just need to box that in. So the left-hand side of this graph is actually right here, so I'm just going to mark it, and the right-hand side is here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw those in. I am trying to box it in from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Hopefully your lines are a little bit straighter than mine. So I just need to count these. This left-hand side crosses at -5. So I'm going to go from -5. The right-hand side crosses at 7. So I go from -5 to 7. Now here's where these signs come into play. Remember, domain is all of the x values. So I'm going to stick an x in the middle just to say we're talking about domain. And then if a border happens on an open dot or does not end, well, that doesn't apply here, right? This graph clearly ended, and it was a solid dot in there, right? That dot was closed off. An open dot is going to look like that. You won't see that very often on an air test. We use the less than sign, but in all other cases, so if you're touching the graph, it's closed in, and you actually hit it, you're going to use the less than or equal to sign. So at -5, I actually hit the graph. So I'm going to use that less than equal. And on the right-hand side, at this 7, I actually hit the graph. So again, less than equal. So that's how we do domain. Range, go ahead and change colors for me. So again, I'm going to circle this guy. The range goes from the bottom to the top. So I'm going to look, where is the bottom of this graph? The lowest point I see is here. The top of this graph, the highest point I see is here. So I'm just going to box those in real fast. So I'm going to draw real nice straight lines. Really follow that grid, it helps. And remember, bottom to top. Every year, everybody wants to do from top to bottom, and it does not work like that. Bottom to top. So if I look at the bottom here, that bottom dot hits at -9, I believe. Let me actually just erase this a little bit because I'm having a hard time seeing. Ooh, this is good that I made a mistake. Because look at this. This is not actually the bottom of the graph. That guy is lower. And I had a hard time seeing that because of all my colors on there. So I apologize. Here is my bottom of the graph. And that is at -9. So the bottom is at -9. The top of the graph is at +9. Now for domain, we threw an x in the middle because domain talks about all the x values. So for range, we're going to throw a y in the middle because we're talking about y values. Now remember, most of the time you're going to use this less than or equal to sign. I actually hit it on the bottom, so I'm going to use less than equal. I actually hit it on the top, so I'm also going to use less than equal. Right? Anytime you have those solid dots, it stops, you hit it. And like we said, it is a function because it passed the vertical line test. All right, so I'm going to grab my colored pencils again. I'm going to stay consistent. I'm always going to do domain in these red colors. Now remember, the domain goes from the left to the right. However, there's an issue here. If I look at this graph and I follow it to the left, that's not a dot right there. It stopped because it ran out of graph. It actually keeps going to the left and keeps going to the left. This guy, see how it stopped on a dot? It said this is the end, no more left. This guy keeps going, keeps going. So I can't box it in on the left. And remember, if a graph continues on in any direction, that limit is -infinity or infinity. Left-hand side, we said, was -infinity. So it doesn't have a left-hand side, -infinity. What about on the right-hand side? If I follow this graph to the right, that again is not a dot. It keeps going. So it keeps going to the right. That would be positive infinity. All right, now remember, we put an x in the middle if it's domain. Now, if a border happens on an open dot or does not end, we couldn't draw on our lines. It didn't end. We're going to use the less than sign. So it's less than, less than. We couldn't put a border on either side. All right, I'm going to go back to my green for the range. Oh, didn't change colors there. Back to my green for the range. The range goes from the bottom to the top. And in this case, I do see a bottom. The bottom of the graph is right here. So I can box it in on the bottom, and it crosses at 2. But if I follow this line up, or if I follow this line up, it doesn't stop, right? It ran out of graph. It keeps going. So I cannot put a limit at the top. I can't box it in anywhere. Remember, if it's on the top, it's infinity. And I put a y in the middle because it's range. Now, at 2, I actually hit. So I'm going to use that less than equal sign. But on the top, I couldn't draw a line, so that one is just less than. Now, I will give you a hint here. Whenever you get infinities, you have options. And the error test will let you write it like this if it asks you to type it in. But sometimes on multiple choice, they won't put the infinity sign. They will just say 2 is less than or equal to y. And they won't put the infinity. They'll just say it doesn't have a top, so I didn't put anything. Now, for domain, where they're both infinities, sometimes the error test will write that as all real numbers. Now, you don't have to know that, because if you're allowed to type in your answer, it will let you type in the infinities, and that is fine. But if you ever see a multiple choice question, you should know that the infinities might not be there. But again, if you're writing it, I like to put the infinities there because it reminds me that I checked for them. But if you're looking for a multiple choice, you might not see them, and that's okay. So let's go scroll on down. Now remember, these guys are also functions. It passes the vertical line tests. So yes and yes. So I'm going to go back. I like my colors. Domain, all the x values. So I need to go from the left. Oh, I'm sorry. Domain is in red. The domain goes from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. If I follow this graph to the left, though, does it stop here? No, there's no dot. It ran out of graph. It keeps going left. Remember, keeps going left is negative infinity. And if I follow it to the right, no dot. It just ran out of graph. It keeps going right. So that's positive infinity. X in the middle because it's domain. Since I couldn't actually draw my lines, it's the less than signs without the equal to bar. And if you like saying all real numbers, that's fine too. You're allowed to type in all real numbers on the error test. That would also work. For range, range goes from bottom to top. This graph does have a bottom. The bottom is right here. And that looks like it's at -5. The top, now remember, just because it stops there doesn't mean it actually stops. It'll have a dot on it. If you see something like this, that line stops at that dot. In this case, it just ran out of room to draw it. So it would keep going, keep going, keep going. So we can't draw a top on here. And remember, if you can't go any higher, it's infinity. A y in the middle, because we're talking about range. Since we actually hit at the bottom, we could draw our line. It is a less than or equal to sign. Since we did not have a top, it keeps going upwards. I can't draw my line. It's just a less than sign. So let's go back to our colors. Let's talk about domain over here. The domain goes from the left to the right. Now, if I follow this guy left, that's not a dot. It would keep going. It would keep doing this little swirly bit. It just ran out of room to draw it. So the far left, negative infinity. It didn't stop going left. We just ran out of room to draw it. And if I follow it to the right, again, it would keep going. We just ran out of graph. So negative infinity to infinity. Since I couldn't draw either of my lines, it's just going to be the less than signs. For range, remember, range is bottom to top. And this one does have a bottom, right? The bottom, it actually hits the bottom several times. It hits here and here and here and here, but that's okay. It never goes below that. So the lowest point it ever hits is -1. What about the top? Does this graph have a top? Try to draw it in. The top of the graph, again, it hits several times. It hits here and here and here, and it would always bounce between those two. So the top of this graph is at 1. Now remember, we put a y in the middle because it's range. Now, my graph actually hit that bottom line, so it's going to be less than or equal to. It does hit. It can be equal to -1. It can be -1. It hits it. Same for the top. It can be at the top. It does hit it. All right. Last two. Remember, these are also functions. That's fine. They pass the vertical line test. And if you don't remember what the vertical line test is, go back and check your notes from task 1. So domain in red. Try this one yourself because this one does have a left, it does have a right, it does have a top, it does have a bottom. Try and draw those in yourself. So domain from left to right. Here is the left, so I'm going to draw my line in. Here is the right, so I'm going to draw my line in. I'm going to try and be straight lines about this. The left looks like it goes through -8. The right-hand side looks like it goes through 2. Remember, domain has an x in the middle because we're talking about x values. And I actually hit both sides. I was allowed to draw my lines in, so these guys are going to get my less than or equal to lines. For range, in this case, it kind of works out nicely because here's my bottom and here's my top. It doesn't always work out that those are the endpoints like that, but sometimes it does. Make sure I draw this the correct place. So my bottom is at -5. My top is at 8. Remember, range is the y value, so I'm going to put a y in the middle. And because I was allowed to draw my lines, I can actually do the equal to signs. I do hit both places. All right, last one then. Domain goes from the left to the right. So if I look at this guy, the left-hand side, is that a dot or did we just run out of graph? Well, there's nothing to the left of it. We hit the edge of the graph. So this guy is -infinity. They just didn't draw this half, but it's not a stopping point. So -infinity all the way until here. Now look at this guy. That is a dot. It actually stopped right there, right? There is more graph and they just did not draw it, and you can see it's a little bit darker right there. I know that it is hard to see, especially on tiny graphs. If this was on a computer screen, I would tell you to zoom in so you see that dot. This guy stopped. So it stops at 6. Remember, x in the middle. Now, at 6, I could draw my line. So I get the less than equal to sign. But on the left-hand side, remember how we say there's no more graph? We just ran out of graph. It hit the edge. So I could not draw a line. The line was just already there. So no equal sign. The range goes from bottom to top. And in this case, I would be very, very careful because see how these guys, they give you lines to follow. So it's really easy to draw straight across. For these, I usually have to either fold up my paper or something. The bottom is right here. So the bottom goes there. The top is right here. So my top goes there. So the bottom is at -6. The top is at 18. Remember, it's range, so I'm going to use y. And I could actually draw both lines. So this guy is contained. I can hit -6 and I can hit 8. All right, go ahead and take your notes, put them in a safe place. That's either your folder or keep them out so they can help you on the vocab that's coming up next.